What happens when a woman shares her relationship doubts with another man, and that man flies across the world to see her? For Laura and Beeran, what started as a romantic trip to Turkey quickly turned into a tense emotional showdown the moment Michael entered the picture. And once Beeran realized Michael was no longer just a voice on the phone, everything began to spiral. At first, this looked like a simple couples trip. But the moment Laura admitted she had been confiding in another man and that he was already on his way to Turkey, the entire relationship changed. Because this was never just about advice. It was about jealousy, hidden feelings, and a love triangle that was about to explode. At first, Laura and Beeran's trip to Turkey looked like the kind of romantic getaway that was supposed to bring two people closer together. The setting felt almost perfect. Historic places, quiet moments, beautiful views, and the kind of atmosphere that makes it seem like a struggling relationship might finally find its balance again. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like a couple trying to reconnect, rebuild trust, and figure out whether their future together still made sense. But underneath that calm surface, something much more dangerous was already building. Because the real problem between Laura and Beeran was never just distance, culture, or communication. The real problem was trust. And once trust starts cracking inside a relationship, every conversation becomes heavier, every silence becomes suspicious, and every outside influence suddenly feels like a threat. Laura had already started noticing things that made her uncomfortable. Questions about money that did not seem to have clear answers. Rumors about debt that felt bigger than she expected. Talk of gambling that made her wonder whether Beeran had been fully honest about the life he was asking her to step into. None of it exploded all at once. Instead, those concerns slowly piled up until doubt became impossible to ignore. And when doubt enters a relationship, there is usually one obvious test. You either bring those fears directly to your partner and fight for clarity, or you go looking for reassurance somewhere else. Laura chose the second option. Instead of keeping those fears between herself and Beeran, she turned to Michael, a man who had already been lingering around her life for years. On the surface, that decision could look innocent. A trusted friend. A familiar voice. Someone who knew her well enough to listen when she felt uncertain. But this was not just any friend, because from the very beginning, Beeran had never been comfortable with Michael's presence. He believed Michael's interest in Laura went far beyond friendship, and that suspicion changed everything. The moment Laura shared her private relationship doubts with Michael, the situation stopped being a simple conversation between two partners. It became a triangle where every word carried emotional weight, every piece of advice came with hidden consequences, and every decision started to feel like a test of loyalty. That is what makes this situation so explosive. Because once a third person enters the emotional center of a fragile relationship, the story is no longer just about love. It becomes about influence. It becomes about jealousy. It becomes about who gets heard, who gets trusted, and who gets pushed out. And Laura was about to learn that the hard way. Because by the time she admitted to Beeran that she had been talking to Michael about their problems, Michael was no longer just someone on the phone. He was already on his way to Turkey. And the moment Beeran realized that another man had flown across the world for Laura, this relationship stopped looking fragile and started looking like a full emotional war. Link. https:/u2.b/nhkd8k7iat4. At first glance, the situation between Laura and Beeran looked like a relationship going through the kind of tension that many couples experience when two people from very different worlds try to build something together. The setting seemed almost romantic. A beautiful trip filled with historic places, quiet conversations, and moments that looked like they were meant to bring them closer together. Anyone watching could easily believe that. This was a couple trying to strengthen their connection and figure out their future together. But beneath that calm surfaced something far more complicated was already growing. Because the real problem between them was never just about distance or cultural differences. The real problem was trust. Trust had started to crack long before this trip. began, and once that crack appeared, it allowed doubts to spread into every corner of the relationship. Laura had begun noticing things that worried her, conversations about money that did not quite make sense, stories about debts that seemed larger than she first believed, rumors about gambling that made her question whether she truly understood the man she was building a future with. None of these concerns exploded all at once, but they quietly stacked on top of each other until she found herself wondering if the person beside her was completely honest about his life. When those kinds of doubts appear in a relationship, the obvious solution would normally be direct communication. Two people sit down together, they talk through the concerns, they face the uncomfortable questions head on. That is how trust either gets repaired or finally collapses. But Laura chose a different path. Instead of keeping those worries inside the relationship, she turned to someone else for guidance. She reached out to Michael, a man who had already been orbiting around her life. For years, Michael was someone who had known her for a long time, someone she trusted to listen without immediately judging her decisions. On the surface, that might seem harmless. The natural act of asking a friend for advice during a difficult moment. Except Michael was not just any friend. Beeran had never been comfortable with him. From the very beginning, there had been a tension surrounding Michael's presence in Laura's life, a tension that Beeran never managed to ignore. He believed that Michael's interest in Laura went deeper than friendship, and that suspicion colored every conversation that involved his name. So when Laura shared her concerns about Beeran with Michael, she unknowingly transformed a private relationship issue into something far more dangerous. What should have been a conversation between two partners became a triangle where every word carried a second meaning and every action could be interpreted as betrayal. Once that door opened, the dynamic between all three of them started to shift. Beeran sensed that something had changed even before he knew the full details. People often recognize emotional distance long before they understand the cause of it, and Laura's behavior began to reflect the uncertainty she felt inside. She still spent time with him, still smiled, still tried to enjoy the moments they planned together, yet there was a new layer of hesitation behind her expressions. He could feel that something was off, and that feeling slowly turned into suspicion. At the same time, Michael was becoming more involved in the situation than anyone expected. The more Laura described her doubts, the more he positioned himself as the voice of reason in her life. He listened carefully, offered advice that sounded thoughtful and measured, and presented himself as someone who simply wanted the best outcome for her. But advice can carry hidden motives, especially when emotions are already tangled. The strange part about Michael's behavior was that he never openly declared any romantic intention. Instead, he stayed in a gray area that allowed him to appear supportive without directly challenging the relationship Laura already had. That ambiguity gave him a powerful position. He could influence Laura's thinking while still claiming that he was just a concerned friend. From the outside, it might have looked like kindness, but for Beeran, it felt like interference. That is what made the situation so unstable. Each person believed they were acting from a place of concern, yet each person's actions quietly pushed the conflict further forward. Laura wanted reassurance that her doubts were not irrational. Michael wanted to prove that he understood her better than anyone else. Beeran wanted to protect the relationship from someone he believed was waiting for an opportunity to step into his place. Three different motivations, all colliding inside one fragile connection. When Laura and Beeran arrived at the ancient city of Ephesus during their trip, the setting should have been perfect for reconnecting. The ruins carried thousands of years of history, towering columns and marble pathways that reminded visitors how many lives had once passed through that place. For someone who loved history as much as Laura did, it was the kind of location that could turn a simple outing into something unforgettable. Beeran had planned the visit carefully. He paid attention to the things Laura enjoyed and arranged activities that would excite her curiosity. Walking through the old streets together, he explained details about the ruins, pointed out structures that had survived centuries, and tried to show that he cared enough to create meaningful experiences for both of them. To anyone watching from a distance, he might have looked like a partner making genuine effort. But the problem with gestures like that is that they can be interpreted in more than one way. Were these plans the actions of someone deeply invested in the relationship, or were they the calculated moves of a man trying to keep everything under control? That question hung in the air as they explored the ruins, even if neither of them said it out loud. Laura smiled as she admired the architecture around her, yet her thoughts were already drifting back to the conversation she had with Michael. The advice he gave her echoed quietly in her mind, shaping the way she viewed the relationship standing right in front of her. Eventually, the moment came when she decided to bring her concerns into the open. They sat down together, surrounded by the quiet echoes of a place that had existed long before their personal drama ever began. It should have been a calm conversation about fears and expectations, the kind of discussion couples sometimes need in order to strengthen their understanding of each other. Instead, it became the spark that ignited everything. Laura admitted that she had worries about Beeran's financial situation. She mentioned the debts she had heard about and the gambling rumors that made her uncomfortable. She explained that those things had made her question whether their future together would be stable. Then she revealed something that changed the entire tone of the conversation. She had spoken to Michael about those concerns. For a moment, the atmosphere between them shifted so suddenly that it felt like the air itself had become heavier. Beeran's reaction was immediate, not because of the doubts she expressed, but because of the person she had chosen to involve. From his perspective, this was not simply about asking for advice. This was about inviting someone he already distrusted into the center of their relationship. The frustration in his voice came out quickly as he asked why she would share such private concerns with someone he believed was waiting for an opportunity to break them apart. To him, it felt like a violation of the boundary that should exist between partners and outside influences. Laura tried to explain that she only wanted a second opinion from someone she trusted. She insisted that Michael's perspective helped her think more clearly about the situation, and that his intentions were nothing more than supportive. But the explanation did not calm the tension. Because for Beeran, the issue was not simply about advice. The real problem was the possibility that Michael's presence in Laura's life was growing stronger at the exact moment when their own relationship was becoming fragile. And when relationships become fragile, every outside voice begins to sound like a threat. That is when Laura mentioned something that made the entire situation even more explosive. Michael was coming to Turkey, not weeks later, not someday in the future. He was already on his way. The moment Laura said those words, the mood between them changed so sharply that it felt as if the entire day had been pulled out from under their feet. A few minutes earlier, they had been walking through the ruins of an ancient city surrounded by sunlight and quiet history. But suddenly the conversation had dragged them into something far more uncomfortable. Beeran stared at her for a moment as if he was trying to process what he had just heard. Michael was coming to Turkey, not sometime in the distant future, not for a casual visit weeks later. He was already traveling, already on his way toward the same place where Laura and Beeran were trying to fix their relationship. To Beeran, that single detail transformed the entire situation from a misunderstanding into something that felt almost like an invasion. What made it worse was that Laura had not told him earlier. From his perspective, this was not just surprising news, it was proof that important things were happening behind his back. When someone you already distrust suddenly appears in the middle of your relationship without warning, the natural reaction is to assume the worst possible motive. Beeran's frustration came out immediately. He asked why Michael would make such a decision without even speaking to him, and why Laura had allowed the situation to develop this far without saying anything. His voice carried That tense mixture of anger and disbelief that often appears when someone realizes that control over a situation is slipping away. Laura tried to explain that Michael had decided to come on his own. She insisted that she had not asked him to travel, that he had simply booked a ticket because he was worried about her and wanted to see the situation for himself. The explanation might have sounded reasonable to someone hearing it for the first time, but to Beeran, it only confirmed what he already suspected. If Michael cared enough to fly across the world just to involve himself in their relationship, then his interest in Laura clearly went beyond simple friendship. From Beeran's point of view, that kind of behavior looked less like concern and more like someone stepping forward to claim an opportunity. That thought immediately pushed the conversation into a darker direction. He began questioning whether Michael's real goal was to interfere with their relationship and position himself as the better option. The idea that another man might arrive in the middle of their fragile situation and try to influence Laura's decision about the future made his frustration grow stronger with every passing moment. Laura tried to calm him down by saying that Michael only wanted to share his perspective and make sure she was safe. She repeated that he was simply a friend who cared about her well-being. But the more she insisted on that explanation, the less convincing it sounded to Beeran, because deep down he believed that nobody travels across continents for the sake of neutral advice. To him, Michael's arrival felt like a challenge. The conversation between Laura and Beeran ended without any real resolution. Both of them walked away carrying their own version of what the situation meant. Laura believed she was simply navigating a complicated emotional situation while seeking support from someone she trusted. Beeran believed that an outsider was deliberately inserting himself into their relationship at the worst possible moment. That difference in perspective made everything that followed almost inevitable. Later that evening, they went to a wine tasting that had already been planned before the argument began. The event was supposed to be another attempt to enjoy their trip and reconnect, but the tension between them followed them there like a shadow. Instead of relaxed conversation and laughter, the atmosphere felt stiff and uneasy. Every small comment carried an edge of frustration, and even simple questions sounded like accusations. Beeran struggled to hide how irritated he still felt about the news Laura had shared earlier. He kept returning to the same point, asking why she had not warned him that Michael might come to Turkey and why she had allowed the situation to unfold without involving him. Laura responded by saying that Michael's decision had not been hers to make, that he had acted independently. She insisted that she could not control whether he chose to visit and that the situation was simply complicated. But complicated situations rarely stay neutral for long. Beeran began explaining how the entire scenario made him question the level of respect that existed in their relationship. In his mind, a partner who respected him would not bring someone he disliked into such a sensitive situation, especially when that person had already expressed opinions about their relationship. What he wanted from Laura was reassurance that she would protect the boundaries of their partnership. What he felt instead was uncertainty about where those boundaries actually existed. Laura listened to his concerns, yet her responses continued to focus on the idea that Michael meant well and that his involvement should not automatically be interpreted as something threatening. She explained that she valued his opinion because she believed he had the ability to look at the situation objectively. To Beeran, that explanation sounded almost insulting. From his perspective, it suggested that Laura trusted Michael's judgment more than she trusted his own words. The idea that someone outside the relationship could influence her decisions about their future only made his frustration grow deeper. As the evening continued, the emotional distance between them became more obvious. They were sitting in the same place, sharing the same table, yet the conversation felt like two completely separate arguments happening at the same time. Beeran was trying to defend his place in the relationship and push back against what he saw as interference. Laura was trying to convince him that Michael's presence did not automatically mean that their relationship was under attack. Neither of them fully understood the other's perspective. While this tension was unfolding, Michael was getting closer. The flight from the United States to Turkey is long enough to give someone plenty of time to think about why they are traveling and what they expect to happen when they arrive. 4. Michael, the journey represented something that had been building inside him for years. His relationship with Laura had always existed in that strange middle ground where friendship and potential romance overlap. They had known each other long enough to understand each other's personalities, long enough to share personal conversations that many people would never reveal to casual acquaintances. At one point in the past, Laura had even hoped that their friendship might turn into something more serious. But Michael never took that step. For years, he remained in the role of supportive friend, someone who listened to her concerns and offered advice without openly expressing romantic intentions. That hesitation kept their relationship from changing into something deeper, and eventually, Laura moved on to explore other possibilities. Now she was in Turkey with another man, trying to build a future that might take her life in a completely different direction. When Michael heard about the problems she was experiencing with Beeran, something inside him shifted. The situation suddenly presented an opportunity that he might not see. Again, if Laura was questioning her relationship, if she was feeling uncertain about her future, then perhaps this was the moment when he could finally show her how much he cared. That possibility made the long journey feel worthwhile. By the time his plane landed in Turkey, the emotional triangle that had been forming for weeks was about to become something far more immediate. Because now the three people involved were no longer separated by distance. They were about to share the same space. The next morning began quietly for Laura and Beeran, but the calm atmosphere did not last long. Laura received a call that she had been expecting yet still seemed unprepared to handle. Michael had arrived. His hotel room would not be ready for several hours, and he asked if he could come by the apartment where she and Beeran were staying until it was available. The request placed Laura in an uncomfortable position. On one hand, she knew that inviting him over would immediately escalate the tension with Beeran. On the other hand, refusing the request would mean pushing away someone who had just traveled across the world because he believed she needed support. For a moment, she hesitated, weighing the consequences of both options. Then, she agreed. After ending the call, she turned toward Beeran with an expression that suggested she already knew how the news would be received. She explained that Michael had landed and that he would be arriving at the apartment within minutes. The reaction was exactly what she expected. Beeran's face tightened with disbelief as he realized that the situation he had feared was about to unfold in real time. The man he believed was trying to interfere with his relationship was not only in Turkey, he was now on his way to their front door. 10 minutes later, there was a knock. Laura walked toward the door, feeling a mixture of excitement and anxiety that she could barely hide. Beeran remained seated, his posture stiff as he prepared himself for the encounter he had been dreading since the moment he first heard Michael's name. When the door opened, Michael stepped inside with a polite smile, greeting Laura warmly, before turning his attention toward the man who clearly did not want him there. For the first time, the two rivals were standing in the same room, and the tension between them was impossible to ignore. For a brief moment, the three of them stood there in silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy, even though nobody has raised their voice. Michael stepped forward with a polite smile that tried to make the situation look normal, as if visiting someone's apartment after a long flight was just a casual social call rather than the beginning of a confrontation that had been building for weeks. Laura greeted him warmly, clearly relieved that he had arrived safely. Her excitement was visible even though she tried to keep it controlled, and that small detail did not escape Beeran's attention. The way she smiled, the tone of her voice when she said hello, the way she immediately began asking him about his trip, All of it felt like confirmation of the very thing Beeran feared. This was not just a friend visiting. This was someone who had traveled thousands of miles because he believed he had a place in her life. Beeran forced himself to stand up and acknowledge Michael's presence, though the greeting he offered carried none of the warmth that Michael had shown. His words were technically polite, but the tone made it clear that politeness was the limit of what he was willing to offer. Michael introduced himself and extended his hand, but the handshake that followed was brief and stiff. It looked less like a friendly introduction and more like two opponents acknowledging each other before the beginning of a competition. Laura attempted to keep the atmosphere calm by offering drinks and suggesting that everyone sit down. She moved toward the kitchen, leaving the two men alone in the living room for the first time since Michael had walked through the door. The moment she disappeared into the other room, the tension between them became almost impossible to ignore. Michael tried to start a conversation in the same relaxed tone he had used when he first arrived. He asked simple questions about the trip and the places Laura and Beeran had visited, clearly attempting to ease the awkwardness that hung between them. But Beeran's responses were short and distant. He answered just enough to avoid complete silence, yet every word carried a subtle message that Michael was not welcome. His body language made the message even clearer. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded, eyes watching Michael carefully as if he were trying to measure the man sitting across from him. Michael noticed the hostility, but chose not to react directly. Instead, he continued the conversation in a calm and almost overly friendly manner, as though refusing to acknowledge the tension might somehow make it disappear. But ignoring tension rarely solves anything. Eventually, the conversation drifted toward the television that was playing quietly in the background. Michael glanced at the screen and asked what Beeran had been watching before he arrived. Beeran replied that it was a classic American film. Michael smiled slightly at the answer, commenting that he enjoyed older movies and asking whether Beeran liked that style of film. The response he received was unexpected. Beeran said that he was not interested in classic movies. What interested him, he explained, was violence. The statement hung in the air for a moment, heavy with the kind of meaning that cannot be mistaken. The words themselves might have sounded casual, but the way he said them made it clear that they were not simply a comment about entertainment. It was a warning. Michael paused, unsure whether to laugh the comment off or treat it seriously. The expression on Beeran's face suggested that humor would be the wrong choice. His eyes held a steady intensity that made the conversation feel less like small talk and more like a quiet test of confidence. Rather than escalate the situation, Michael decided to redirect the conversation. He asked whether Beeran enjoyed living in Turkey and what his plans for the future looked like. The question might have sounded innocent, yet the context made it feel loaded, because both men understood what the future represented in this situation. Laura's presence in Beeran's life offered the possibility of a new life in the United States. That possibility was something Michael had thought about many times during his flight. Beeran answered the question briefly, saying that his future depended on the relationship he was trying to build. The tone of his voice made it clear that the relationship he was referring to was not something he intended to share with anyone else. At that moment, Laura returned to the room carrying drinks. She sensed immediately that the conversation between the two men had not gone smoothly. Their expressions were controlled, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way that was impossible to hide. She placed the drinks on the table and tried to lighten the mood by asking Michael about his journey. He explained that the flight had been long but worthwhile because he wanted to make sure she was okay. The comment sounded supportive, yet it carried an implication that did not sit well with Beeran. If Michael felt the need to check on Laura's well-being personally, then he clearly believed that something about her situation was unsafe or unstable. To Beeran, that implication felt like a direct insult. He asked Michael what exactly he believed was wrong with Laura's situation. Michael responded carefully, choosing his words in a way that made it difficult to accuse him of overstepping. He explained that Laura had expressed concerns about certain issues in the relationship and that he simply wanted to make sure she was thinking clearly about her future. The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, yet it confirmed exactly what Beeran had feared. Michael had not come to Turkey merely to observe. He had come to influence the outcome. That realization made the conversation sharper. Beeran pointed out that decisions about the relationship should be made by the two people involved, not by someone who was entering the situation from the outside. He emphasized that Laura was capable of thinking for herself and did not need someone else arriving from another country to tell her what to do. Michael did not raise his voice, but he refused to back down from the position he had taken. He said that when someone cares about a person deeply, they sometimes feel obligated to step in when they believe that person might be making a mistake. The phrase cares deeply was subtle, yet its meaning was obvious. Beeran looked directly at him and asked whether that concern came from friendship or from something more. For the first time since the conversation began, Michael hesitated. He did not give a clear answer. Instead, he said that his priority was making sure Laura ended up in a relationship where she felt respected and secure. The statement might have sounded noble, but it also suggested that he doubted whether Beeran could provide those things. Laura watched the exchange with growing discomfort. She had hoped that bringing the two men together might lead to some form of understanding, but instead the meeting was revealing how far apart their perspectives really were. Every attempt to keep the conversation calm only seemed to expose new layers of suspicion. Michael eventually admitted that his first impression of Beeran concerned him. The aggressive tone of the earlier conversation and the comments about violence made him question whether Laura would truly be happy in such an environment. Beeran responded by saying that Michael had no right to judge him based on a single meeting, especially when Michael had already decided that he was the better match for Laura.